It's my immense pleasure to be joined by Anna Danylchuk. And, well, she needs absolutely no introduction. She is, for many, the face of Ukraine, the voice of Ukraine, of Ukrainian reason and resistance to Russian aggression. And if you aren't aware of a series of videos explaining Russian imperialism, explaining propaganda and its mechanics, I would definitely check those videos out. That's essential background to anyone who's either interested in this or who would describe themselves as Ukrainian activists. And before we jump into this, thank you to everyone who supports the channel, especially those who've helped support through Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, all the usual things, and supported Anna and other creators in this ecosystem as well. Especially important now as I am heading back out to Ukraine, and I think I need some warm clothes and some equipment that I don't have in order to get through the next trip. Anna, what should I bring with me to prepare for what is, I think, not just a harsh winter, but one in which Russia is trying to really leverage those conditions to its advantage?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being that island of truth, resilience, and stability in this very chaotic world. And here in Ukraine, we are very grateful that you keep talking about the things the world needs to know and that you are brave enough to travel to Ukraine in such fierce times. Well, you need a lot, but I'm also sure that people around you will warm you up with the joy of seeing you here and speaking to the world about our resilience and Russian violence, because right now we have a very long period of extremely low temperatures, very unusual for Ukraine in the recent decades. I do not remember anything similar at all, like since my school years. And I'd say like below 15 Celsius is something very unusual already. And we also had a lot of snow. And during nights, the temperatures fell to -20, -22. Yeah, that's extreme. And what is worse, it lasted for a very prolonged period of time. It actually still is. As I record this video, for example, we have -11, and that's once again not usual for us. And Russians are openly talking about this opportunity to freeze us to death, to use it as a leverage to make Ukrainians surrender. I still literally laugh, even when it is cold, at how far away they are from the understanding of the Ukrainian mindset, because what they achieve is just the country. And no one staying in these cold houses without electricity thinks about the desire to join the Russian Federation. We want it to burn, and bring us some heat from the burning Kremlin. But they constantly targeted electric stations, electric substations. It is a very carefully planned operation, and you know that Ukraine lacked some of air defense missiles, and it was extremely wrong from the side of those who could have provided them to us, because we use them, we do not count them, look at them, we use them to protect these homes. And now thousands of houses are without electricity. And as a result, it's closely connected to the heating systems, to the water supplies. And in times of such frosty days, it is very, very difficult. You cannot prepare for such things, especially when Russians aim to target electric substations close to nuclear power plants so that it breaks the chain of the delivery. And it's so absurd how the world's attention shifted to this madness of the American president, trying to analyze things that are not worth our analysis because they align well with the diagnosis. I'm sorry. And no one is talking that one of the largest cities in Europe is all in cold and darkness because of constant Russian attacks on the civilian infrastructure. But to tell you the truth, what is good to some extent, Russians experience very similar problems, and not because of the Ukraine's attacks on their energy infrastructure, but because they burned billions of dollars, not rubles, on the destruction of Ukraine, forgetting to check and maintain their own systems. And I constantly speak about that because hundreds of thousands of Russians are without heating, electricity, but because of their own economic mismanagement and violence. And I do have Russians coming into comments telling me like, but a very similar situation is developing in Kiev. Look at your porches, they are all frozen, people are freezing. forgetting one very important difference. This happens in Ukraine because of your attacks on our energy infrastructure. And in Russia, it happens again because of Russia, not because of our attacks, but because you're so crazy, so poor, so evil. So we are all praying that spring comes, and Russian propagandists openly say that, oh, soon this frosty period will pass and we will lack the priority. Just think about what they see as a priority, an opportunity to freeze Ukrainian children. They are losers. So you have to take a lot of warm clothes. People started loving this thermal underwear that people use for, like mountain resorts in Ukraine. That's what you walking, you sleeping. Also, layering helps. It keeps your warmth in. And many people I know, like my relatives, go to bed with bottles of warm water. And you're lucky if your house has a gas supply, because in the capital, those skyscrapers, they often have all electricity, including the ovens. And if you have gas, you are considered a very lucky person. And of course, for me, it's always a priority to have a lot of chargers that you have. You charge them when you have an opportunity so that you can record, you can share, you can work with all that. The connection is not always perfect because even the providers of the internet, if they are without electricity for a long period of time, they will drop the quality. But we never shut down internet as they do in Russia, even in such harsh circumstances. And when you come, you will see that despite all of this darkness, all of this evil, people know what to do. If you're going through hell, do not look back. And the plan is to defeat Russia. I hope it will happen in 2026.
And the other feature, I think, is that people, without being coerced to do so, will support each other, support their neighbors, set up, charging points or these tents that we've seen, these sort of resilience points. Um, I'm not saying that in Russia this is completely absent, but actually, whenever it appears, and of course it's twisted because it's towards really evil ends, but wherever people seem to, through this full-scale war, pop up and say, well, let's do something, let's create a charity, let's support our armed forces, it seems that the KGB, FSB, whatever they're called these days, the state tries to prevent that emerging, tries to prevent people actually from helping each other. I would say it's not necessarily in the culture anyway, or widespread anyway, but they don't want people solving problems and assisting each other. It's a society designed to destroy exactly those trends.
Yeah, I have a friend whom I once interviewed for the book I'm working on, and she is a person who went through occupation in Melitopol and later managed to escape the city that now remains under the Russian control. And she was an active participant of a cycling movement. Like they had an NGO that wanted to change the roads in Melitopol to make them bicycle friendly. And they were developing this like marathons, the culture of cycling. And they were not into politics or something. And at the very beginning of the occupation, they were constantly targeted with various threats, and she realized she needed to leave because these Russian forces, they are always against any unions, any organizations that exist between people, even if it's about, I don't know, making toys or makeup advice, or bicycle sport, because they understand that these people are well organized, and well organized people make each other stronger, and they can come up with some successful projects. And what if these projects are against the these occupational forces? And something similar we observe all over Russia. What is a seen and what is indeed a strength here in Ukraine, an ability to organize, to self-organize, to stand against the evil, because let's be realistic, it is the civilian population that did a lot to stop Russia's invasion during this very first weeks. Later, they turned into military, they became military people, but those with rifles on the streets of Kiev were civilians. And that what is impossible in Russia, and they protect the government from any kind of people's organization, once again, even if it is very far away from politics.
Before we carry on with this video, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported the channel through 2025 and all those, of course, who are contemplating supporting us in 2026. We've run many events on the ground in the UK, Europe, and indeed in Ukraine as well. And some of the images of those events are on the screen as you see this. Your assistance has been absolutely invaluable to making it happen. And in 2026, we won't be able to do this scale of activity, have this impact, or even think about having these ambitions without your help and support. There are many ways you can help. Of course, liking, subscribing, making sure you are actually subscribed to the channel, because sometimes YouTube seems to kick people off their subscriptions unexpectedly. But actually also adding comments and sharing materials around your network. It all has a tremendous impact. Now, I know many people watching this channel contribute to Ukrainian charities and do what they can, but aren't necessarily people of huge means. But if you can, if you're able to, and if you see value in this work, please do contribute if you can. We have links to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and even GoFundMe. That is all in the description of the video. Any support you can give will make sure that we can have not just the same level of impact this year as we did last year, but we can actually increase it. And the aim, in fact, is to double our impact this year, to go from reaching about 1.5 million people per month with our content, doubling that to 3 million, and also doing many more events to help support Ukraine, help support the concept of democracy and resilience. And as we know, 2026 is turning out to be even more dangerous than 2025 was, and the existential threat to democracy, freedom, Ukraine, those aligned with Ukraine, is greater now, perhaps, than it has been at any time since the full-scale war. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for all of your support. And of course, every time we speak, we've never had this issue of what are we going to talk about? In fact, there's never enough time to talk about all the things going on. But it seems that stuff is accelerating. How do you interpret Greenland and the sort of this apparent chaos that is this is coming from this? Because I don't believe in chaos. I believe that someone somewhere has a plan and is benefiting from all this. How could Russia, for instance, benefit from the Greenland chaos?
First of all, I want to say that people of Ukraine stand firmly with Greenland, with Denmark. We are the ones protecting the international law and order with our blood. We know what it means. And we also are way more concerned about such conversations than the nations that never experienced an invasion, believing that it is just a ramble. No, it's not, because it lasts for too long and it undermines NATO. And the greatest second danger, apart from the violation of sovereignty of a country, is also this blow to NATO alliance. If one NATO country attacks another NATO country, then NATO does not exist anymore. And we don't need to ask question who wants this. Of course, the Kremlin. And the Kremlin is just like drinking champagne all the time, I'm sure, observing the new ideas coming from the White House. Of course, it's totally fake to talk about any security for the United States, because Greenland was always open for the US military bases. And if the American people want more soldiers there, I don't know, more missiles there to protect from any Russian or Chinese interference, I'm sure Denmark wouldn't mind. You don't need to get this country. You don't need to annex this country to be able to do it. That's the backbone of NATO, that we are all for one. You can openly do, if you speak about the reasons, you have explanation for that. Also, it's pretty funny to observe how Trump speaks about the need to protect this from Russia, forgetting that we kind of need to protect Ukraine and the rest of Europe from Russia's invasion and their violent plans. And I am a bit disappointed that many still choose this strategy to appease, in this case, Trump, with his very absurd ideas, which only encourages him to continue. And I hope that more strong answers will come from the European leaders. I'm actually happy that President Zelensky did not say yes for a peace council at this moment, where like we have Russia and China and Belarus invited, and some people here are joking why Dracula, for example, was not invited, or the spirit of Hitler to that peace council. So I think that the case with Greenland is extremely bad and with bad timing. And of course, it gives Russia an extremely uh, nice explanation of why they want to violate other countries' sovereignty, why they want to redraw borders on the map, because like everyone is doing that. And now the US, that for centuries, or at least for 1 century, was a guarantor of the international law, does the same. So this is an extremely evil precedent, and much depends on the reaction of the countries, on the actions they are prepared to take. And I know that Ukraine is prepared to support and protect the sovereignty of Greenland, of Denmark, and no other option exists.
And, with Russia, unfortunately, Putin, as we were talking before we recorded, he has got all the characteristics of a paranoid tyrant. He does have all sorts of pathologies, but he is unfortunately not insane. He's not insane in the way, let's say Hitler would have made some extraordinary, ridiculous decisions. There's some certain logic behind his actions, even though they are driven to absolutely evil ends. What do you think of the idea that last year he saw that the drone incursions against Europe had several impacts? Yes, Europe started to wake up a little bit to the threat and it started to invest in defense a bit more, and there's talk about a drone wall, etc. The biggest outcome of the incursions last year against European airports and Poland, etc., was the stockpiling of air defense systems. The transfer of air defense munitions fell quite sharply following those drone attacks. Could it be that Putin is looking at this and saying, okay, that maybe that was the outcome they wanted, maybe it wasn't, but they would have noticed that that was in fact the outcome. Therefore, some of the other chaos we're seeing, like Greenland, may have partly the aim to starve Ukraine of the essential air defense munitions, in the knowledge that a Europe that feels threatened will not ramp up its production fast enough, and it will keep some of those munitions to itself for its own perceived self-defense.
Well, now that you're saying it, it looks like a win-win situation for the Kremlin because, first of all, they spread fear across the European countries, they demonstrate their vulnerability, and they also slow down or stop the support for the Ukrainian air defense. And it is a like strategic decision that brought the results Putin expected. And I still do not understand how people do not see this direct connection with Putin violating international order first in 2008 with Georgia, then in 2014 with Ukraine, then in 2022 with the full-scale invasion. And that the only way to stop this from spreading, from inspiring Donald Trump or Xi Jinping from doing similar moves, is to demonstrate the tremendous failure of the Putin's regime, to bring justice, to bring accountability. And Europeans, I can see the Ukrainians, Europeans too, but I mean like those yet untouched by Russia's aggression or the US aggression countries, should think about this tremendous opportunity to defeat Russia while it is still in Ukraine. We never wanted our cities to turn into a battlefield, but it has already happened because of Putin. So let's finish his regime here. And there are also many strategies that work very well to weaken Russia. So it's not just like we're talking about the strategic move of Putin to stop the supply of air defense, cause panic in Europe, and like disagreement between some EU members. But there are lots of successful strategies that work to defeat Russia. And I think we do not focus and invest in them a lot. And there are more and more of the dissatisfied people. We all know that in Russia they sacrifice their freedoms and rights for the sake of this illusion of stability that Putin always promised them. That's how he got his power. And now he does not, he fails to provide this even Russian stability to them with canceled flights, with constant explosions, with gasoline crisis, rising prices, rising taxes, problems with the withdrawal of money, and so on and so forth. And we've discussed before we hit recording that conscription, general conscription, may be inevitable for Putin in 2026. So he brought lots of problems. They sacrificed, they gave him their freedoms for him to bring them safety and security in this Russian understanding of this world. They need way less freedoms, but he failed to do so. So the consequences will come because Russia is a very violent country that will react to that. And it's time to stop being afraid of the collapse of the Russian Federation. Imagine that people were afraid of the collapse of the Third Reich because, Hitler was so determined to organize it all, and some nations silently agreed to that. So maybe we should not. One of the big things is that back in the times of the Second World War, there were more decisive leaders. Maybe people had better memories of the First World War. And what we see now that many the so-called leaders are extremely atrophied, like they are not prepared to protect the things they always took them for granted, and they are trying to find excuses for their indecisiveness. When at this moment in history, no excuses can work because now it directly touches literally every country. I was exchanging messages with some of my friends, and we all agreed that right now there are no safe places on the planet.
The question, of course, always is what next? And it seems the world's media and actually even a lot of pro-Ukraine activists are completely distracted by what Trump's doing. They're completely distracted by this torrent of sort of nonsense that comes out. But Russia hasn't gone away. In fact, Russia is doing its thing, and people are failing to notice what's actually going on in Russia. So let's turn to that because you do in your videos cover an awful lot of these stories, and because they are incredibly important, not just to keep people engaged, but also to keep this little flame of an idea alive that Putin cannot win, that Russia is not capable of meeting its objectives in Ukraine, that it is actually failing militarily, economically, politically. It's becoming more fragile and brittle. And we can't predict when Swan Lake will be playing out across television screens. But all of his actions make it more and more likely month in, month out. So what's your take on that? And it must be difficult to continuously try to get people's attention away from the orange monster in the White House and say, no, we have to concentrate on defeating Russia. And here's the evidence that it can be defeated.
I agree with Vlad Wexler, who keeps saying, maybe in like a different, more eloquent manner, but the fact that Trump is the consequence, not the reason. To some extent, Putin is also the consequence, not the reason, because people inside Russia allowed him to stay in power for decades. And then people around Putin, leaders like Angela Merkel, constantly chose ways to satisfy his desires instead of speaking openly about the threats that Russia imposes. And unfortunately, the world is still extremely Moscow-centered. Like if we forget about the orange disaster and we think about because okay, some actions of Trump do distract people from making the proper decisions, but Trump is extremely chaotic. He changes his opinion like twice, three times a week. With
I was
Russia,
about
it's
to say a
all
day,
a day.
sometimes.
With Russia, it's all very stable. Like it's always following the plan to restore reconstruct the USSR. And uh, I do believe that like Trump is like emotional roller coaster, and I want to think that people still understand that Russia's threat is constant. It may be that Trump delivers more shows, but both problems are big. And with all that, people are still extremely Moscow centered. And when I read newspapers, when I read reliable in other areas websites, they often get their information from the Russian sources, like what Russians are saying about their economy or what Russians are saying about their I don't know, oil industry, construction industry, and they get these pessimistic messages like everything seems not that bad according to, I don't know, Peskov or according to Lavrov. But these are world's greatest liars. These are the very same people who said we would never attack Ukraine. They did. They also promised to take Ukraine in 3 days. They didn't. They somehow did not notice how we destroyed the Black Sea Fleet, or how Gazprom and Lukoil now on the top of debtors, not billionaires. And people fail to notice this. You cannot get information from Russia and take it seriously. And as a very close society and a very dangerous place that no journalists want to travel, like we're talking about like dozens or hundreds that are permitted to work there, and usually those who are permitted are working for Russia. But we do not, they people have to accept that the farther you are from Russia, the less realistic picture of it you have. And that's why you have to trust experts on Russia. And these are people in Ukraine, people in Finland, people in Poland. And not only they experienced life under Moscow regime, but also we do have some connections. We can read the language as you do, and it is an extremely important asset of your channel that like you can read Telegram channels. You can watch some Russian videos. And what I observe right now and what gives me tremendous optimism, and I started talking about that on a new channel with longer videos on the Danylchuk, that Russian vloggers, Russian Z vloggers, military vloggers are in full panic mode. They keep enumerating failures. On the state level in Russia, they forbade to compare the duration of the special military operation to the Great Patriotic War. You know that they've used the myth of the Great Patriotic War as one of extremely important in Russia's modern propaganda, forgetting about the importance of the participation of the fight of the British people, the American people, the Polish people, describing it just as a Russian victory. Uh, Not focusing on the fact that for them, the Great Patriotic War began in 1941. And until that, for 2 years, they were fully in alliance with the Nazi Germany. But once again, like every Russian at school, at home knows that the Great Patriotic War was so big, was so bloody, was the greatest sacrifice of the Russian people, and it lasted less than the special military operation in Ukraine. Why on earth then do you keep it naming special military operation? Special military operation takes a day, 2 weeks maybe, with a couple of, I don't know, combat units landing somewhere in the mountains, finishing 20 people, and that's it. This is a war that destroys Russia from inside, and they keep faking that like negative growth of the Russian economy. That's what they keep saying. Or they reported the closure of a number of oil terminals and oil refineries due to external, not even interference, but like external factors. And stop building your agenda, stop building your messages, stop building your articles, stop building your analysis on the information that you get from the official Russian sources, because it is BS. The fact that 3 million people did not manage to withdraw their money and their bank cards were blocked during this first 20 days of January is the best signal that the Kremlin does everything to prevent people from withdrawing the money. According to the Moscow Times, which is to some extent an oppositional source, but it works with the sources inside Russia. They do have access to real people, real experts, real bankers, and they provide this information that in 2025, Russians withdraw the largest amount of cash, like a trillion, added it to the circulation, which is very bad for the economy in general. But this is the greatest signal of the panic that is growing among the apolitical Russian population that now sees how prices are rising, how restaurants are closing. And I don't see people talk about that enough. All the history teaches us that usually such big empires they collapse really quickly. Why? Because they fake this normalcy. They use their influence. They pay money to other, I don't know, journalists or bloggers around the world to keep this image, to put everything in disguise when in reality everything is shaking, everything is collapsing. I want to remind it, and I will finish with that, that a couple of months before the collapse of the USSR, everyone on the state Russian TV and everyone on the American TV kept saying about the fact that collapse of the USSR is impossible because everything is so good, everyone likes the project, and the economy is just booming and everything is perfect. This is lies, and lies from the Russian side and inability from the Western side to decode this lies. So do use people who know more about Russia than you do. I mean, like you are also a source because you speak the language, you know what to read. But I hate it when some people who cannot find, like Czechia or Hungary on a map start reasoning about the situation in the Eastern Europe.
Yes, and some of the stuff, even if they're correct about some stuff, um, you can hear things that just I know it's like fingers on a blackboard, you just hear the noise of what they're saying grating against reality. And there's other reasons, aren't there? I mean, let's relate this back to actually really significant sort of geopolitical things. Listening to the speech of the Belgian Prime Minister, who was justifying not handing over Russian central bank assets. And actually, these ideas that are endlessly recycled through the media that Russia is inevitable, that Russia is huge, you cannot defeat it, it's got so many more resources and blah, 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 infinite people. You heard that parroted by the Belgian Prime Minister basically saying, well, nobody in Europe really believes that Russia can be defeated. No one really believes this, that, and the other. That is a self-limiting, a self-checking belief, not in reality, but in certain narratives that have been constructed to actually stop you from taking action. So you can see that this stuff, unfortunately, has a very negative kind of impact. And there are those who will decide not to take action because why would you put all your treasure and resource into something if the outcome is certain? If Russian victory is a certain outcome, well, you might feel sympathy for Ukraine, but you may well mentally come to see it as a lost cause, or you may switch your brain off and say, okay, this is too tragic. This is too sad. I'm just going to retreat into my own little cozy life and certainties. So these narratives kind of work. I think the greatest antidote to that is listening to someone like Robert Borovdi, a sort of Magyar, and talking about the ratio of Russians who are eliminated, turned into, sunflower fertilizer on Ukraine's soil, in the ratio to his train operators. And I think one of the ratios he mentioned was 1 to 37. Well, I'm sorry, there aren't enough Russians on this planet to maintain a war at a ratio of 1 to 37. I'm not saying that's the ratio up and down the front, but I think it's important to have narratives that counter what clearly is quite effective, boring, unimaginative, but quite effective Russian narratives around inevitability.
Right. And, I am once again tired that people who know very little or people who had direct connections to Russia, I am afraid to I did not check this information, but there are also rumors that this Prime Minister of Belgium was also a mayor of Antwerp, and he was largely involved in diamond trade with Russia when Russia was under sanctions and so on. Anyway, I what I like about myself is that I never pretend to be an expert on the regions and countries that I have never been to, never spent some time in. I don't know a lot about their history, their economy, their lifestyle. And this arrogance of some, I will sound now like Putin, Western elites who believe they know everything, is extremely discouraging and leads to more problems for their correspondent countries. I have started interviewing leaders of various movements inside the Russian Federation that see their nations in future as independent. For example, I have an interview with a Burat representative, and soon another one is coming. And I discover a lot for myself about the Russian demography, for example. What is widely discussed inside Russia that they lack this, what Putin describes as genuinely Russian population, the essence of the Ruski Mir, and that non-Russian population of the Russian Federation that belongs to a totally different anthropological group, to a totally different religious, linguistic groups, now outnumbers the Russians. So when we're talking about 140 million, first of all, they say most likely it's close to 100 million, not 140 million, because this, how do you call it, like when you count the population, where it took place really long ago. And the percentage of Russians, as Putin sees them, is very low. So soon the Buryats, Tatars, Chechens will outnumber Russians. And this destroys the idea of this Orthodox empire when it's not, when the majority is going to be Muslim, the majority is going to be non-Russian speakers. Plus, even those who identify as Russians, many of them are actually not sharing the Ruski Mir ideas because they are not Russian. That is an escape loop, like lots of Ukrainians after Holodomor, to save their lives after being super traumatized, began identifying as Russians to survive, associating in that if you're Russian, you survive. And lots of such nationally diverse, as the Kremlin describes them, republics now suffer most from Putin's conscription, from financial losses. They are not able to cover payments to the Russian war criminals who joined the army. They need to have them. They are freezing, as in Altai Krai, in Irkutsk. There are lots of reports, and Kremlin has nothing to say them because they have no money in the federal budget. No one is talking about that. I don't hear the Belgian, my prime minister, talking about that, talking about the destruction of 40% of Russian oil industry. Did it seem possible back in 2022? And do read a speech of Bush, which we described Chicken Kyiv, when he advised Ukraine not to leave the USSR, and then 2 months later congratulated Ukraine with this newly regained independence and freedom. Do not, I'm sorry, this will be perhaps the quote of our conversation today. Do not take politicians that seriously. Take these internal civil attitudes, movements more seriously than what politicians say. They are very slow in feeling the moods of their nations too. And if they are talking about a foreign nation that they know very little about, they are simply reproducing what they were told by someone who sat next to them on one party in Davos. That is not the real picture. The real picture is that now more and more protests are taking place in Russia, and some of them are nationwide. For example, there was and still continues from time to time a nationwide protest of Russian taxi drivers. I don't see anyone talking about them. Okay, these people are not good Russians. They are not protesting against this evil violence that Russians commit in Ukraine, but they are talking about their own problems. Gasoline crisis caused by the Ukrainian drones attacks, by the destroyed Russian energy export, and so on, leads to higher prices on gasoline. And now, with electricity outages in Russian cities, people need even more petrol because generators work on that. And with increasing taxes, with increasing prices, these taxi drivers stopped earning money. They have to keep their prices low because people otherwise do not buy their services, but they cannot because they don't get a salary. And they have huge Telegram channels where they exchange messages, they plan their protests, and they do it nationwide. And Russia is the largest country in the world. So it's not something sporadic. It's not a group of brave people standing against some ideological problems. No, these are very down to earth people that started organizing themselves. And we've just discussed with you that one of the things that Kremlin fears the most is this population organizing into groups of resilience, which one beautiful day may actually turn them into society. Because right now, I always intentionally name Russians a population. But what if these taxi drivers will keep organizing? What if these private entrepreneurs will join them? Because thousands of businesses will be destroyed, and Putin's oligarch Deripaska shouts about that. They not only increased VAT 2% more, they also lowered the threshold for businesses that have to pay. It was like 50 or 60 million rubles of turnover, and now it's just like 10. So this literally destroys thousands of businesses. What if they will start organizing? And what
And
if people,
VAT as well, gone up from 20 to 22%, which doesn't sound
yeah,
like a
that,
lot,
that's
but
what I'm talking.
has a huge impact on business
Yes.
profitability.
And what if Putin announces this general conscription?
And
And
that's
if,
what I wanted to come on to because that's an interesting one, isn't it? On the one hand, you've got a build-up of pressure. You've got certain groups who are no longer making the money they were before. That is the only time Russians, I think, at this period of history are going to protest is when their own economic privilege is threatened. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. The Russian opposition functions on the same rules of privilege as well. They're not fighting for universal rights, they're fighting for their own privileges and those of their perceived electorates. I mean, that would be ironic, of course, that the revolution is actually run by taxi drivers. That would really make a quite an extraordinary movie. But mobilization is the other thing because it seems to me again, if you, as many have withdrawn from paying attention, and if you presume that Russia has infinite people when it doesn't, and it's been clear for some time that the quality of recruits they're getting is going down and down and down. As you see that, the people on crutches, you see people with various health and mental issues being herded into the army, villages literally stripped of their male populations. I'm sure many of the wives are only too delighted to get rid of their alcoholic, useless husbands and turn them into cash, but that's another story. Putin is going to be forced to either dial down his ambition, it seems to me, in terms of the territory he can take and the scale of the offenses he can mount, or he's going to need to turn Russia into a fully centralized, fully mobilized, fully coercive society, a kind of Soviet military machine, or he's going to have to give up on some of his ambitions.
but the collapse of the USSR was very much fueled by this very exhausting and unnecessary war in Afghanistan. Putin also conscripted people from very distant republics, not directly from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the dissatisfaction grew because people clearly lost the reason why they are part of the Russian Federation. They take away your people, they use your resources to make people in Moscow richer, and what do you get in return? Ukrainian drones, for example, reached Tatarstan. Russia put a lot of military production facilities. One of the largest, if not the largest, drone building factory is in Tatarstan. Tatarstan in 1991 or 1992 proclaimed independence. They had their own constitution. They wanted to be free. They are Tatars. They are Muslim. They have a totally different heritage. They do not identify as bearers of the Ruski Mir idea. Later, Yeltsin and Putin suppressed any independence movement there, but that's a big country with lots of resources, with lots of opportunities. And what do they have now? A lot of people conscripted to fight for the idea of the Ruski Mir, which is foreign to them. Second, all of their natural resources are used to pay not for the repairs of the roads or heating or something, but to build missiles that cost a lot. And when they have problems and they address the Kremlin tells them, sorry, we don't have resources. We have a hole for trillions of rubles in the federal budget. We don't have money for that. And they also have Ukrainian drones coming to their locations, leading to explosions, destructions, air raid alerts, fear, anxiety. And these are the consequences because Russia is fighting this war, but it was not just the choice of people in Tatarstan. Don't you think that more and more of them will start asking this question, why are we in this project? Why are we a part of the Russian Federation if the very presence in this monster Frankenstein leads to problems and no benefits? And I'm sure that now more and more thinking that way. And you will come up with lots of reactions. For example, Sochi, which I'm not mistaken, could have been a part of Cherkess people. And I remember Ukrainian drones destroying an oil depot there. And it's really close to Putin's dachas because it's like a resort. Sochi is one of the most popular, if not the most popular resort on the Black Sea in Russia. And there were tons of videos where people record explosions and they say, wow, these are Ukrainian drones, but why do they target Sochi? They need to target Russia. And you won't see these translations on different media. So people in Sochi that record these explosions cannot connect like reason and consequences because deep down inside, subconsciously, they do not identify as Russian. And they say, why do Ukrainians target Sochi? Why don't they target Russia? Because Sochi, according to this modern map, is Russia.
It's the same with Kursk. I mean, one would have thought that Kursk and Belgorod are key parts of Russia and a Russian national identity, but it became obvious that people have a high degree of indifference in Moscow and other places. You know, these places are too far apart. They may not have relatives in the town, and everything is conducted along very direct lines. You know, it's as if politics, as if you do not have the imagination in Russia to be able to imagine or empathize. Well, we know that empathy is something that really has been purposefully eroded or destroyed or never really even allowed to develop. But it seems that there is no transnational identity, that the ideas of Russian world and all these things, they're actually very hollow and they're imposed from above. They're not necessarily, it really, these ideas aren't necessarily inhabited passionately by the majority of the population. They are, to all intents and purposes, indifferent to all but their own family, colleagues, acquaintances, the things they can see and feel and touch in front of them. If you can't experience it, you don't really have much empathy for it, which I tend to think is fertile grounds for that whole Russian imperial project collapsing. If it is all so artificial, that also means it's rather fragile and brittle as well.
Do you want me to say one very beautiful idea that I've
Oh,
been
please,
thinking about?
please do.
You know, whenever they have protests, and they did have protests in Bashkortostan, they had protests in Saka, and they will keep appearing. A very common tactic is to send OMON, to send some military forces, police forces from Moscow or around Moscow, like Ryazan, very Russian regions, to suppress these movements, these protests, because they know that local police can actually turn the side and join the people. That's what always happens in normal countries. Like that's what they feared in Iran now. That's what we experienced during the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. So like anyway, like if you see like these are your people and you know what they stand for. So they traditionally send foreign forces to close to the Kremlin, those adjacent regions to suppress. And Russia is very big, and usually these protests happen somewhere on the far east, far north, and so on. And now is Ukraine controlling Russian airports? It may be that for some of these special forces, it would be very difficult to reach that location, or it would take them a week when it is already too late if they choose a train or something. So, actually, this gives a very good opportunity for some of this protests, some of these movements to be protected from the arrival of the special forces from Moscow.
It's interesting, and of course we know that aviation parts are even shorter supply this year than they were previously, and
Yeah,
we've
and
had
more to
planes
come.
dropping out of the sky. We have drones shutting down airports. the news which I just seen is that Russia is trying to find investors or to sell Domodedovo. There's no one wanting to buy it. That industry
Yeah.
is so broken.
Dying out. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's a delicious thing.
That's a
Uh,
strategy too. And we have to talk more. I think it's super important to shift the focus from what may keep Russia afloat, what are the signals that they made to regroup, on the strategies that will simply destroy. Okay, if you're afraid of the collapse of the Russian Federation, then that will simply destroy the Putin's regime. And believe me, if it is destroyed, it is not full victory, but it is a huge step, a leap towards that.
And it's not entirely impossible that if you can break up this sort of centralized imperial model, that there won't be some very slow but emergence of something that resembles the sort of the very basic foundations or the it's like the building blocks of life present on comets, you know. There's a few little building blocks of democracy present, but they're
Yeah.
very, very primitive and they're very disparate, and it's going to take a very long time. Coming back, and this is the last bit here, I think, is one of the other advantages I see it as being able to understand not just Russian, but having been there and immersed myself in the so-called, opposition movement and the stuff over the last couple of years, is also having a reasonable level of cynicism behind the so-called opposition, which unfortunately many of our politicians and institutions do not seem to have. Figures like Yulia Navalny and others are taken at their word, and their words aren't really analyzed. The background and context of those words isn't analyzed. What they leave out of their speeches isn't drawn attention to. But I think it's especially important to be able to understand that the Russian opposition in its current form is not necessarily a solution. And if we think any kind of solution is coming from that direction, it prevents us from really properly investing in our own security. It's deferring the idea that a solution is coming from somewhere else. Whereas the advantage I have is that I know that there is no solution coming from the Russian opposition, none at all. If we're thinking that's going to save us or save Ukraine, that's a big zero. In fact, it's another distraction.
Totally agree with you. First of all, I don't see real Russian opposition. They may oppose Putin, his economic steps, but in reality, they very often, like in most cases, share his imperial attitudes. And imperial attitudes are the things that destroy Russia, prevent it from becoming democratic. You know, once Gedroic had a very beautiful phrase about Poland, that Poland will become very successful if it forgets its imperial past. And that's what we witness with Poland. Now, Poland is one of the strongest thriving democracies and a good example for many countries that were once traumatized by communism, but they did forget. On this like real level, we may speak about some individuals, but in general, they did forget about their imperial past. The same recipe goes for the Russian Federation. I don't consider Yulia Navalny. You may disagree with me, but I don't consider her an opposition. And I think her life next to Navalny is actually very, very suspicious in general. Maybe that was one of the reasons for his troubles. Also, Navalny himself, like he changed his opinion before the death on Crimea, but he also had a lot of like shifting opinions. Kara-Murza now is a total disappointment, and this Belarus opposition leaders is total disappointment. And
Or even worse, I don't know if you saw, and I,
yeah,
I, I thought she was one of, I,
the one with the red lipstick.
yeah, the one with the blonde hair who has
Yeah,
genuinely,
yeah.
suffered in prison, and I, 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 I thought that that was a source of hope and a story of positivity. She's come out and said that actually Lukashenko is a realist. He's flexible, and we should make our
Yeah.
accommodations with him. That's that's insane. That is just insane. It's destruction of her reputation in an instant.
So I believe that no real opposition exists in this classical Muscovy Russia, and they might have one interesting special operation that I personally observed because, like, it's not that obvious right now, but maybe a month ago there were tons of articles about Kozak who resigned, and he was Putin's administration. He was one of the ideologists behind the annexation of Crimea. He spent years with Putin in a bunker during COVID pandemics, and many believe that he stood behind the special military operation, but then he began opposing it and he resigned. And there were tons of articles describing him as, like a huge Democrat in opposition to the Russian war in Ukraine all over Russia. And I had this like suspicion, why are they talking that much about him? Maybe they consider him a substitute of Putin if something happened, if a minor coup is taking place or something. I do think that such options are possible, and if it will be the Kremlin coup, it will not bring the liberation. And maybe we should also focus on these national leaders of various republics that are now oppressed by the Kremlin, and they could also be drivers of the independence, as this Kadyrov's case, right? Now, many believe that the accident with his son was no accident. It was an FSB special operation. We don't know, but that they want to take greater control over Chechnya because they understand that the Chechen people do not share Kremlin purposes, Kremlin ideas, or Kadyrov's ideas. That they always wanted to be free and independent, and that they will have more in common with Ukrainian people than with Russian. So maybe we should like analyze different countries. And I did hear this beautiful idea from the Free Nations League, that is an organization that unites such national leaders. And they were saying they are developing a map for this potential dissolution, peaceful dissolution of the Russian Federation. And so that some of these nations can shape something like the European Union, but of the Central Asian countries form. And they have, for example, Buryat people, they have way more in common and they are more inspired by the Mongol development and Mongolia country than Russia. We're not saying whether it's good or bad, but we're talking about this, the way how people identify themselves, how they see their future. And they do not have that imperial virus in their heads.
And that's what we have to work with, what's there and the forces that are there, and not have false hope. I think it's important as well, being able to tap into sources that aren't available. Roman Cymbaluk, Vitaly Portnikov, and others. There are some really strong Ukrainian voices who broadcast in Russian as well. So it's not just understanding the enemy; it's getting access to concentrated information, interesting, sometimes controversial points of view that make you think and make you go back and analyze what you thought were given ideas. I think this is all really useful. There's a handful of people who can do that. There's yourself. Jason Smart and just a few others in this ecosystem. Vlad Vexel, of course, can as well, and he's also tapped into some interesting political sources from the Russian emigre community, which can be quite useful or interesting, or at least they can generate ideas, whether we like them or not, or accept them or not. It can be useful, and so I'm immensely grateful to people like yourself, Vlad and Jason and others who can inject this kind of stuff into the ecosystem. I think it is massively, massively important. Anna, we'll probably have to. I've abused your time and generosity here. And we had a huge long chat before we hit record as well. So for the viewers, you missed out on that, but it was an immense pleasure and privilege for me to be able to do that. I mean, thank you so much for everything you do, and thank you for coming back on today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your work, for your dedication, and for an amazing community of people that you shaped around Silicon Curtain and all the other amazing projects that you're doing, even in the coldest and most dangerous times here in Ukraine. Thank you.
Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава!
I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by the Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Bucha massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda. media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
The Ukrainian people are very resourceful and they're very determined, and they've got a very good reason to be determined. Russia wants to exterminate the Ukrainian nation and just enslave it and absorb it. So they've got every reason to do everything necessary to win this war.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.